Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai, welcome to the Early Childhood Seminar Series. We'll begin our time together with a karakia. Me inoi tātou. Kia hora te marino, kia whakapapa pōnamu te moana. Hei huarahi mā tātou i te rangi nei. Aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou i a tātou katoa. Haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. It's great to have you with us today for this presentation by Dr. Kane Meissel from the University of Auckland. Kane is a senior lecturer in educational psychology at the Faculty of Education and Social Work and has been a lead researcher for the education domain of the Growing Up in New Zealand study since 2015. We're looking forward to hearing from Kane about findings of the Growing Up in New Zealand study related to the educational lives of the cohort children from birth to age 10, and considering the relevance of these findings for the early childhood sector and the education sector more widely. The recording of this presentation will be available on our Early Childhood Seminar Series YouTube channel after the seminar. Please do use the chat function to connect with each other and the panelists. And if you have any questions for Dr. Meissel, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask them, and he will respond to them at the end of his presentation. I'll now pass over to Dr. Deborah Widdowson to welcome and introduce Dr. Kane Meissel. Thanks, Deb.
Tēnā koe, Justine. Kia ora koutou katoa. So just a little bit more about Kane. It's my pleasure to introduce Kane and to just to note that as a domain lead on the Growing Up in New Zealand study, Kane has consistently emphasised the importance of teachers in young people's lives, leading the development of a survey of teachers as key informants at the 12-year data collection wave. And Kane has also led the research into the cohort's educational experiences during the initial COVID lockdown, further enhancing the study's ability to understand what contributes to disparate educational outcomes. Now, the topic of Kane's talk today is birth to age 10, what it's like growing up in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Kane's going to present a snapshot of findings from the Growing Up in New Zealand study. And for those of you who are not familiar, Growing Up in New Zealand is a longitudinal cohort study following more than 6,000 children in the context of their families from pre-birth to early adulthood. The study was begun in 2008 and it's set to continue until approximately 2030. To date, the tamariki and their whānau in the study have contributed more than 100 million data points, painting a comprehensive picture of child development across multiple domains of influence within Aotearoa. Importantly, the cohort is highly diverse, with approximately 1 in 4 children identified as Māori, 1 in 5 as Pacifica, and 1 in 6 as Asian. And 1 in 3 children were born to at least one parent who didn't grow up in New Zealand, and a similar proportion is growing up in a multilingual household. Given the breadth of the study, this talk will focus mainly on the educational lives of the cohort children from birth to age 10, as they first navigate early childhood, and then during their transition to school, and most recently their experiences of schooling during the COVID lockdown period. So I hand over now to Kane.
Thank you, Deb. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you for the invite and thank you all for zooming in. So as Deb indicated, we do have rather a lot of data, which is both a privilege, but also quite a challenge when trying to think about what to cover within 35 to 40 minutes. I was saying to the team that I initially started out with 120 slides. I've reduced it to 40, so that should hopefully mean that we get away in time for dinner. So I want to start by just acknowledging the families, particularly those who have let us take the photos that you'll see throughout the presentation. So those provide some really nice ways of sort of contextualizing the data and reminding us that we are talking about young people and their whānau and their lives. So it's not just about individual data points, it's about real people, their experiences and their lives. So The presentation, as Deb indicated, I'm going to give you a very, very quick background of the Growing Up in New Zealand study, particularly for those that are not familiar. We'll talk about some of the high-level findings. I am going to focus a little bit more on some of the early childhood information, as well as give you some of the kind of high-level information that we collected at age 8, as well as during the COVID survey, which was when they were age 10. So just to provide a quick introduction, the overarching aim of this study is to provide contemporary population relevant evidence about the determinants of developmental trajectories and well-being for children growing up in 21st century New Zealand. So as we know, unfortunately, New Zealand ranks pretty poorly in a range of different early developmental outcomes. So determining what works to support positive development for all groups of children is really the key focus of this study and has been since its inception. So we do have some pretty exceptional work that has gone on throughout our history. So the exceptional value of the Dunedin and Christchurch longitudinal studies, for example, tells us very clearly about the importance of longitudinal research and the insights that we can gain through those types of studies. So to date, those both the Dunedin and Christchurch studies have published many hundreds of different academic articles. They've been used for various policy insights and so on. So we have some really exceptional insights into human development that we've gained through those studies. So it does, to some extent, some people might say, well, why do we need a new one? But as you will all be very aware, there's been some pretty huge demographic and societal changes since those studies began more than 40 years ago. So as you know far better than I do, the early childhood sector in particular has changed massively, as well as our understanding of the importance of early life development and the influence of things like early childhood education on that early development. So a contemporary study was considered vital. And that led to an initial request for proposals, which was put out by the New Zealand government in 2004. And so in that proposal, they indicated that the Ministry of Social Development and the Health Research Council of New Zealand wished to establish a new longitudinal study of New Zealand children and families to gain a better understanding of the causal pathways that lead to particular child outcomes. So a really important aspect of the study was the desire to understand what led to positive child outcomes in particular. So with that sort of acknowledgement that there are quite varying experiences for children and their families, there was the need to understand what led to thriving. So as Deb indicated, the study kicked off in 2008. And the particular focus, there was a particular focus on the first 1,000 days. So some have compared a child's evolving health status in the early years to the launching of a rocket, as small disruptions that occur shortly after takeoff can have very large effects on its ultimate trajectory. And so that sort of ethos did influence quite a lot of the early development of the study. I do note that it is that quote is in relation to the health status, but it equally applies to education and does reflect the fact that the study did have a slightly stronger emphasis on health in its first years. So I often say, anyone that knows me will know that I often say that you can never have too much data, but the downside is that we can only scratch the surface tonight, but I will finish the presentation with a link to our website and social media so that you can take a look more deeply if you're interested. So one of the unique features of the Growing Up in New Zealand study was that recruitment was actually conducted before the cohort was born. So we typically see the cohort as the children and the parents, their whānau, their other people in their lives. We consider those to be really important people, but they're informants about the developmental context of the child or young person. So in that vein, it is interesting, and it provides some additional insights in that we recruited prior to the child actually being born. So the number of mothers that were actually recruited was 6,822, but in doing so, we ended up with 6,853 children at birth. And that reflects the fact that there were also some twins, as well as a small number of triplets. Partners were recruited and interviewed independently from pregnancy onwards, but unfortunately we have had some quite difficult conversations around funding over the years, which has resulted in not being able to always collect data from partners if one is in the child's life. So the sort of focus has been primarily on the main caregiver, which in most cases has remained the mother, but not in every case. So the diversity is another really important aspect relative to previous longitudinal studies. This is the first large contemporary study in New Zealand that has a really strong ability to understand different trajectories for Māori, for Pacific and Asian groups independently, rather than just in relation to majority ethnic groups. Another aspect is the ability to consider multiple ethnic identities. So young people increasingly identify with more than one ethnic group, and that is important to understand as well. So at the time, recruitment was via the Auckland, Waikato and Manukau DHBs. That gives us a pretty wide spread, and it is broadly generalizable in terms of both ethnicity and family socioeconomic status, and represents around 11% of births during the recruitment period. We've managed to retain the cohort pretty well, particularly compared to international studies. So the overall opt-out to date is less than 5%. But that doesn't mean that we necessarily manage to catch up with every family at every time point. COVID, as well as increasingly complex lives and living situations, have presented challenges. Moving completely to electronic data collection was tried at the 6-year data collection wave, and there are some advantages in that, but it also tends to decrease our ability to engage with our harder to reach communities. So to date, we've tended to keep elements of face-to-face data collection all the way through. So as you can imagine, that was pretty complex during the most recent data collection wave at age 12, which occurred during COVID. So there were some quite delicate considerations that needed to go on there, especially the prospect of an interviewer going into people's homes when people were quite concerned about COVID, and how to manage that. The birthplace of the parents. So as I said, because one of the other things to keep in mind is that because the cohort was recruited while the mothers were pregnant, it means that every child within the sample was born in New Zealand. But the parental birthplace is highly varied. So 1 in 3 of all cohort children have at least one parent born outside of New Zealand. This is one of these annoying maps that doesn't do a very good job of representing the Pacific, but this, the 10.5% that's next to the 64.1% represents those whose parents were born in the Pacific Islands. So predominantly that was across Samoa, Tonga and Fiji. There were 11% that were born across Asia, very broadly. So that was pretty evenly across East Asia, South Asia and Southeast Asia, and smaller proportions from other regions, including 2.7% from Africa and 6.7% from Europe. So the Kete diagram that you see is one of the ways that we represent this study to sort of give an idea of the things that we look at. So there are 6 different domains, and the themes are the major cultural groups that we're looking at quite closely. It is viewed as an interwoven kete because of the recognition that even though we might be sort of focusing on one particular domain, so for example, I'm the education domain lead, but I work closely with researchers across all of those other domains and themes, because as we know, everything interacts with everything else. So understanding what's going on in the home environment, for example, has massive implications for everything that we see in the educational context. We typically collect information in multiple different ways. So for example, at age 8, we collected both a mother and child proxy questionnaire. So the mother questionnaire about things that were going on from the perspective of the mother. And once again, the mother providing information about the child. There was also a child questionnaire. So this was the first time that we gathered information directly from the child in terms of their own perception and of their experiences. There's tended to be at every time point observations of the child. We have mother-child interactive tasks. There's also biological samples. At age 8, we also had a time use diary that was completed by the child after the interview that gave an indication of the sorts of activities that they were involved with. There are obviously other really important people in children's lives, as I've already mentioned. So we do have partner data at some of the age points, but as I've said, we've encountered some funding difficulties in terms of being able to do that at every time point. Quite excitingly, from my perspective, we've managed to collect some teacher data. So we had a teacher questionnaire at age 12, so in the most recent data collection wave. It's something that I've been working on and pushing for quite a long time, basically since the time that I started working with this study. So it was a little bit of a coup to finally get it across the line. I don't have access to the data yet, so I can't share any snippets of the findings, but we're expecting to receive those data within the next week or so. So in terms of some of the findings, I'm just going to start with a little snapshot from before the children were actually born. And I'm going to start with some qualitative information. So although much of the data that we collect are quantitative, mainly because of the size of the cohort, we also try and capture the voices of the cohort via a series of more qualitative responses. So before the children were born, we asked both the mums and their partners what their hopes and dreams were for their child. So we had some that provided pretty specific dreams, including things like wanting their child to be an All Black. But most mothers and partners, so around 60%, just reported that they want their child to be happy and healthy, which I think is a pretty nice thing to hope for your child. I'd hope that everybody would really, I'm sure that they do, but that was the most prominent thing on their minds for more than half of the cohort. So moving into some of the findings that we had from early childhood, one of the things that we found was that antenatal intentions, particularly in terms of early childhood education and childcare, were a really poor predictor of what was actually going on at both 9 months and 24 months. So in a sense, that's probably not surprising, because if you think about the huge adjustments that occur after birth, it's pretty hard to imagine, I think, for most families, what life is going to be like once the child is born, when you're sort of thinking about it from the perspective of pregnancy, especially if you're first-time parents. So although they were, so of those that indicated that they wanted to use early childhood services by the age of 9 months, 84% was still actually using either no one other than themselves, other than the parents, or they were using, or they were getting babysitting by a relative or other family member, and not actually making use of any early childhood education service or childcare service. So even at the age of 2, 58% were still not using any form of early childhood education service, even though those mothers had indicated that they wanted to. One of the other aspects that we saw in the early years was that there was quite a lot of moving around the different services. So 41% switched between the age of 9 and 24 months. So that's not just switching from one provider to another, that's actually switching the type of provider. So for example, from a teacher-led to a more of a home-based environment, or the other way around. And again, we saw a similar proportion that changed between 2 and 4.5. Overall uptake of ECE though was reasonably high, broadly in line with what we see in the participation rates that are published publicly. So at 9 months, it was around 1 in 3. By 2 years, it was about 60%. And by 4.5, it was actually 97%, so quite high. The predictors of early childhood education usage that we have identified, interestingly, there are no significant differences by maternal ethnicity or education. And also no differences by birth order of the child. So if the child is the first or a subsequent birth, that doesn't really have any influence over whether they do attend an ECE service, which is interesting. We do find, unsurprisingly, that usage of ECE is lower in rural areas, likely to do with availability, as well as among those living in highest deprivation quintiles. So that's in higher areas of so low socioeconomic or high deprivation. So that does seem to be associated with costs. Mothers that report no current partner are more than twice as likely to use early childhood education services, which is also not super surprising, but is quite an important finding. The nature of employment, particularly in terms of the mother's employment, more so than the father's, if a father was present. Maternal employment that is quite regular. So if people are working regular time schedules, they're 7 times more likely to use an early childhood service compared with mothers that are not working. In comparison, those that are working irregular shifts are only around 3 times more likely to do so. So among those that didn't use ECE at any time, so it is quite a small proportion, but in general, 39% of that remaining 3% said that they just didn't feel that there was any benefit in doing so. A smaller proportion indicated that they didn't want their child to be cared for by strangers. Only 8% of that group indicated that it was a cost decision. So unfortunately, we do need to mention bullying even in early childhood. So New Zealand frequently ranks pretty poorly in the OECD for bullying rates among adolescents, but it really does seem to start from early childhood on. So a third of the children were identified as being bullied at age 4. And for 1 in 10 children, bullying occurred at both 2 years and 4 years of age. So there does seem to be a reasonably high or concerning level of persistent exposure as well. And so because of the importance of this, I'm going to just skip forward momentarily to age 8 so that you can get a bit of an idea of the degree of persistence. So at age 8, we found that 35%, and this is from the children themselves at age 8, 35% said that they were being bullied, that they were bullied in the previous year, and 14% said that that was quite regular, at least once a week. And if we consider all of the data collections to date, it's almost half of the cohort has experienced bullying since they were 2 years of age. We do find that rates increase at school compared with the early years, but there is a proportion, there is a reasonably significant minority that actually is reporting bullying across all of those data collection waves. You'll see that there are quite different types of experiences. So things like being put down and teased are more common than physical. At age 8, technology was not as common, but we do see that the technology type of bullying, so via social media and those sorts of things, has increased during the COVID period. So as I indicated earlier, there is a recognition that educational experiences are heavily influenced by what's going on in the home. So it's a really important aspect to consider both positive and negative aspects of what is going on in the home. So the vast majority of parents do report that they are often experiencing, expressing affection, providing comfort and praising their child. So that's 97% that report doing that. But we do see that 1 in 10 use smacking on a regular basis, and 1 in 25 children have witnessed parental violence. So the important thing to consider here is that this is reported by the parent, by the mother herself, and so that is likely to be an underrepresentation. Another sort of contextual factor is the high degree of housing mobility. So moving house is really common. Half of the children move at least once between 2 and 4 years of age. 20% of children have experienced multiple moves just between 2 and 4. And 20% of children have also moved school. Once they get to school, they move school at least once within the first 2 years of school. And 15% have attended 3 or more schools during that first 2 years of school. So we do see quite high rates of housing mobility, and also the nature of that housing is pretty poor for a lot of young families, and it does tend to be associated with housing ownership. So overall housing ownership is around 55% across all of the early years, and 37%, regardless of, across all of the different housing types, are living in damp or mouldy homes. So it does tend to be quite strongly associated with whether you own your own home or whether you're in a rental. So concerningly, it is a major problem more often in a public rental than in a private rental, which is pretty damning in terms of the public housing that is available. So in line with that, we've also found that 40% of families are experiencing at least one material hardship in early childhood. So that is referring to hardships such as continuing to wear shoes with holes in them because the replacement can't be because there isn't enough money to replace them, putting up with feeling cold simply because the cost of heating is too expensive. 1 in 5 households who were not receiving income were experiencing more than 6 of these hardships. So that there's also quite a lot of variation. We do see an increasing household income over time. So by the age of 4 years, 65% of mothers were in paid employment compared with 53% at 2. But despite that increase in income, the rates of material hardship seem to have remained fairly constant. On a more positive note, despite all of those contextual factors, the vast majority of children get to the end of the early years with very well-developed pro-social behaviours. So that's things like being kind and considerate of other people's feelings, being helpful to someone that's hurt, So 97% of children were exhibiting those sorts of behaviours. But we do see a really significant shift in other behavioural measures between the age of 2 and 4, particularly in aspects like hyperactivity, conduct, and emotional development. And so those findings have been treated pretty seriously in terms of understanding the timing and in terms of identification of children that might benefit from early intervention. But it is important to note that, first of all, that's parental report. Second of all, some children won't have displayed those behaviours yet, and others will lose some of those behaviours for you know, it doesn't necessarily mean that the child is going to develop more problematic behaviours. It's not a diagnostic tool. Moving into the transition to school period, so school transition activities are widely recognised as helpful strategies for successful school transition. So 8 in 10 children had one or more school visit. 3 in 4 had actually visited their classroom, and 2 in 3 had met with their teacher prior to starting school. Only 1 in 5, though, had actually visited with their early childhood provider, and 3% of children hadn't engaged in any of the transition activities. So in terms of general confidence of mothers that their child had the required skills, generally mothers were pretty confident that their child was ready in terms of social skills. So 90% said that that was all going well, but only 60% felt that their child had the pre-reading and writing skills needed to start school. And that was kind of interesting, I felt, considering parents actually reported doing all sorts of home learning activities. More than 60% of them were reading to their child at least once a day, 25% of them were telling stories, 50% were singing songs and playing music every day. More than 50% were engaged in sort of numeracy activities, and 35% were encouraging reading and writing. And so it's sort of quite telling that that is something that more families are a little bit concerned about in terms of whether they've got their child to the level that they need to be in order to go off to school. But despite those worries, we actually found that when we went back and talked to the families when the child was 6 years old, most mums actually said that school transitions were pretty smooth. So in terms of their own experience, 70% said that they had no difficulties whatsoever. Generally, they felt that that was because actually once it came down to it, the child was ready to go to school, and they were happy to do so. They were excited, and about half of the cohort reported that the transition activities that they engaged with were really useful. In terms of some of the difficulties that were experienced, though, 39% of the mothers that reported having some challenges said that they were really worried about their child making friends. They worried that they might not like school, and they also worried about just, you know, sort of sending their child off to school and feeling a little bit sad about doing so. For most of those, though, the difficulty tended to resolve quite quickly within 1 month. So 71% resolved just because of time. 56% said that, you know, once the child had some time to adjust, that was a really good sign. And the impact of the transition, so seeing also that the child was happy and that the school was good for their child, and that they were well supported, were really important factors. So in terms of the child's experience, most mothers reported similarly that their child didn't experience difficulties. So in this case, about 25% of children did experience some difficulties when they started school, though. The reasons for not experiencing difficulties were pretty similar in the sense that they were ready, they were excited, happy about going off to school. But the reasons for those that did experience some difficulties were quite different. So about half of the children that were experiencing some challenges found it quite difficult to adjust to the new routine, had some difficulty with being separated from their family. Around a third had difficulties due to shyness or the rules that they encountered within the schooling environment. Also things like not knowing anyone else in the school. So generally, once again, these did resolve primarily through time. So 83% reported that time was enough. But the major difference was that the time that this took was much longer than it was for the mothers. So there were 22% of the children that were still experiencing some difficulties with adjusting to school more than 6 months after going off to school. In terms of those schooling environments, 94% at age 6 were attending a New Zealand primary school, around 1% were being homeschooled, and 5% were attending school outside of New Zealand. 84% were attending state primary schools, 7% religious schools, 4% private schools, 3% state integrated, and 1% Te Kura Kaupapa Māori, and 1% bilingual environments. So quite a range of different schooling environments as well. So in terms of the overall engagement at school and enjoyment, most children at age 8 did report being pretty happy. So 80% of children reported being enjoying school and said things like this. So I love getting to go to school and knowing my friends are going to be there. And when I come home, getting to see my dog. So pretty important feature. So moving into how the cohort gets to and from school. So as will be of no surprise to anyone navigating Auckland traffic, about 70% of the children are driven to school. But on the flip side of that, 1 in 4 do use some form of active transport as their main way to get to school. Interestingly, considering the proportion being driven, 1 in 3 children actually live within 1 kilometre of school, and 3 in 4, so adding the 2 together, live within 5 kilometres of school. So 5 kilometres is obviously still quite a long distance though, but there is certainly quite a lot that are living pretty close. One of the other things we looked at was before and after school care. So after school care is reasonably common. 1 in 4 were attending some form of after school care at age 8, and 1 in 12 were attending before school care, and 3% of children were attending both. One of the things that we have seen is that there's not a lot of research either internationally or locally that actually looks at what the effects of that sort of additional before and after school care has, either on transition to school or on achievement in school. And so that is something that we're looking at as we get more educational data, particularly in terms of educational achievement and engagement. Languages, pretty important. So the cohort is really linguistically diverse. More than half of the Asian children were identified as multilingual, 1 in 4 of the Pacific cohort, 1 in 5 among Māori, compared with 1 in 20 among New Zealand European. Most common languages include English, Māori, Mandarin, Hindi, and Samoan. And one of the interesting things, though, is that te reo words are really pretty widely recognised. So this graph shows the distribution of the correct answers out of 100 kupu among those whose parents identified them as te reo speakers versus those that were not te reo speakers. So even the non-speakers were generally able to understand about 1/3 of the words out of a list of 100. So there's quite strong recognition of an increasing number of words. Parents and schools. So I am aware I'm rapidly running out of time, so I'm going to have to go through a little bit quickly on some of these things. So just in terms of things that parents were looking for in schools, most 96% really just wanted good resources, and more than 90% looked at reputation, things like fostering strong parent, family and community involvement. But the things that they were looking for in terms of advice, half looked to friends, half looked at the school website and so on. 43% looked at Educational Review Office reports. Very few used books, TV or parenting websites. And at the time, national standards results were available, but only 16% of parents were making use of those. In terms of parental involvement, most parents are actively involved in their child's school. 70% are going to regular progress meetings, but 12% do report no involvement with their child's school, and it does tend to be lower in higher deprivation areas. So 18% in the highest deprivation areas compared with 8% in low deprivation. And that seems to be associated with work status and the degree of flexibility in work. So in lower deprivation areas, there's a bit more flexibility in terms of the work requirements on average. In terms of parental satisfaction, generally we do see quite high rates of satisfaction, particularly in terms of physical needs. But on the flip side of that, we see lower satisfaction in terms of cultural needs. And at age 6, cultural needs were actually the lowest. So only 75% indicated satisfaction with cultural needs. And that increased by age 8 to 84%. Satisfaction tends to be higher, unsurprisingly, in smaller classes. And it tends to decrease with teacher changes. So the more times a teacher changes during the year, the lower the overall satisfaction. One of the other quite interesting insights was the educational aspirations. So this is both the maternal report at age 4 compared with the child's report at age 8. So, I mean, there are some limitations. We do recognise, of course, that it's not really, it's a bit of a false hierarchy here. So there are various aspirations in terms of trades, and we're not sort of indicating that postgraduate or university study should be the pinnacle. So there are lots of different options for young people. But one of the interesting things that we were looking at here was how similar or different the parental aspirations were from the child's aspirations. So at this stage, they tend to be a little bit overlapping, but quite a lot of differences as well. So you'll see that only 42% of the children indicated university as an aspiration, compared with 78% of the mothers. Flipping very quickly into the COVID results. So just to finish off, we sent this survey out to the children in Tamariki in May 2020. So this was at the tail end of the very first lockdown. So most importantly, despite the significant disruption, families in whānau did create a lot of experiences that meant that in general, most reported having a pretty positive time in that first lockdown. So we do, of course, acknowledge that that experience varied for different families and also across time with every subsequent lockdown. So at the time, though, 88% of children said that they felt supported by their family. 79% reported having a good time. Almost all children, 96%, were sharing regular meals with their family, 84% getting good support with their schoolwork. Quite a big increase in the amount reporting doing outdoor activities. and also in terms of more family engagement with each other. So just briefly, I haven't talked about screen time, but screen time is super relevant in terms of COVID. So just to jump back a little bit to age 8. So already by age 8, 95% reported having access to at least one device. By that age, 3 hours a day of screen time was being reported. So that has increased steadily over time, but it got supercharged in COVID. So we saw a massive upswing to almost 5 hours a day during the week and 4 hours during the weekend. So there was quite a bit of variation though. So about 10% of children were reporting more than 8 hours every day. So this is in line in terms of the general increase that we see with international research, but it's even more than we were expecting. In terms of what they're doing with all that time online, doing all sorts of things like YouTube and Hangouts and TikTok, pretty common. Really not doing things like Facebook and Twitter. So that is really decreasing in popularity, as we know. One of the interesting things that we did find though as well is despite so much of schoolwork moving online, 5% of the cohort actually indicated that they very seldom used devices for school or homework during the lockdown period. And that is obviously of particular relevance to understand a bit better. The experiences differed quite a lot. So in terms of school satisfaction from the children, there was a big shift down in lockdown, and that was associated both with ethnicity. So there were some larger declines in school satisfaction among European Māori and those all other ethnicities compared with Pacific and Asian. One of the interesting things that we did find was that there does seem to be a bit of a protective factor in terms of bubble size, although that was more evident for Pacific families than for Asian. But we don't fully understand that, and we do see some variation there. So it does. One of the things that we're looking at is whether the proportion of adults versus children played a role, or those sorts of things. We also saw big drops. So we also saw sort of an association with bullying. So unsurprisingly, both at 8 and during lockdown, school satisfaction tends to be lower if you're being bullied, but that flowed through into lockdown as well. Some of the things that the young people talked about as positive aspects: getting to wake up later because I don't have to go to school, distance learning, organising myself to change from a normal school routine to becoming independent at home using devices to do daily schoolwork, and having time to yourself and getting schoolwork done in my own time. So a lot of the young people actually talked about factors associated with autonomy and doing so in quite positive ways, which was quite cool to see. So things that we identified as being really important for positive outcomes. So as I said, larger bubble size, but also things like participating in activities with their family and whānau. So things like reading, baking, cooking, outdoor sports, and so on. And finally, just to let you know about some things on the horizon. Obviously, we have a lot of in-depth research publications and policy advice that go out all the time, so keep an eye out for those. The 12-year data collection wave is going to be reported in June and July of this year, so keep an eye out for media attention around that. The teacher survey that I've mentioned is likely to be released in August. We also have consent to link to educational data for more than 95% of the cohort. So that's something I've been working on quite a lot for quite a while. So we're working through some of the issues around that as well. So finally, I want to acknowledge all of those involved in this study, especially the Growing Up in New Zealand family and whānau. And just to finish with the whakatauki, kohi kohia nā kākano, whakaretia te pare kereke, kia poa wai nā hua. So this whakatauki speaks to the gathering of seeds, preparing the seedbed carefully and being gifted with an abundance of food. So thinking about the environment that we're creating for tamariki and rangatahi in Aotearoa New Zealand, particularly as they come through the effects of COVID-19 and transition to adolescence. We need to carefully create and maintain nourishing environments to provide well for children's growth and development in order to see them flourish in the future. So thank you for that. So as promised, here are the website and social media addresses. And you can also contact me at k.meissel@auckland.ac.nz. Thank you.
Ngā mihi, Kane. Thank you so much for that really excellent presentation on the Growing Up in New Zealand data. We have some questions. I think we have about 10 minutes available for questions. So if you have further questions, please put them in the Q&A. So I'll get started. There's a question about the sample. And so the question is, was this a managed baseline cohort as opposed to random selection to give the demographic shown for Māori as 1 in 4?
So yes and no. So that was part of the intention behind the selection of the DHBs. So by choosing the Manukau, Waikato and Auckland DHBs, we did anticipate that we would have an increased likelihood of getting a high enough explanatory power for Māori and Pacific in particular. But after the sort of DHB selection, the participation was completely voluntary. But it was every single pregnant mother in those DHBs that was approached at that time. So obviously they didn't all consent, but they were eligible to participate.
Okay, great, thank you. And we have another question from anonymous attendee. Oh, this one's flipped out here, sorry. Will there be a follow-up survey done this year?
So a follow-up survey, we've just finished in the field with the 12-year data collection wave. So that was conducted last year, and the reporting of that will happen in June and July of this year.
Okay, great, thank you. Is parents' expectation of reading and writing skills in line with child development, I guess, and research expectations? What are your thoughts there?
It's an interesting question, actually. So we don't have, one of the challenges that we have is that we haven't tested the children, so we can't tell whether it's directly associated in the early childhood years with the sort of actual level. But I think, yeah, I think it's sort of, it's not so much about whether it's in line with, it's more that, I think families and parents in particular are quite conscious of the sort of academic requirements, I guess, of going off to school, but perhaps feel a little bit less certain of what to do to ensure that they're at that expectation. And some of those expectations are a little bit less clear, like, are you hoping, should your child go off to school being able to write their name? Should they be able to read 100 words? Or, what is the threshold that you should be expecting? And so I think for families, that's a little bit trickier to know than just sort of saying, well, I know that my child, when they go off to early childhood, they have lots of friends, they're getting along with other children, And so they feel a bit more confident about that sort of adjustment than perhaps they do about the academic side of things. Because it's emphasized to quite different degrees, I think, in different environments.
It's a shame that you weren't able to get teacher data at that time.
Yeah, that would have been brilliant.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
We have a question from Susanna, and Susanna says, "Hi Kane, thanks for another great presentation. In regards to the bullying data at the 2 and 4 year DCWs, assuming that it was mother reported, how accurate do you think these data are in painting a picture of what happened at preschool without mum actually there?"
Yeah, so that's another good question. And it is one of the limitations in any kind of almost all types of social research, really. We're often gathering proxies rather than direct measures of things. I think, though, that we do have, particularly because of the study being longitudinal and because of having information over time, both by the mother as well as by the child themselves, and now from teachers as well, you get a pretty good picture of how accurate, if you want to use that word, the parent report information is. And with other things that we have triangulated to sort of administrative data, we have found that parents are pretty good reporting, at knowing what's going on, especially in the early years.
Great, thank you. I think this one's more of a comment. As the first survey in 2020 was probably taken during the wage subsidies back when New Zealand had stamped out COVID, it would be interesting to see how post-COVID lockdown, return to work, etc., has affected whānau and tamariki.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is actually a focus of the 12-year data collection wave that has just completed. We included some new questions in there to get at those sorts of things a bit more closely.
Excellent, thank you. Someone's asked if they can sign up to receive the June-July 2023 DCW report results. Can they sign up for that?
I actually don't know exactly how you would do that, which is a little embarrassing. I think the best way to do that would be to follow us on Facebook, and if you're on Twitter, to follow us there as well, because all of the reports will be announced via those channels.
Right, thank you. And there's a question about the breakdown of ECE services for under 5s. Is there a breakdown? And, is it based on kindies, home-based, home?
Yeah, so there is. There's a few different ways, as you will all know, lots of different ways that can be spliced and diced. The questions that were asked themselves were quite specific. So there's, I think, something like 17 different options that parents were given. And then those have been recoded in various different ways. So some of those are included in the main technical reports, and some of them are included in reports that I've been involved with as well. Yeah, so they are certainly available, yes.
Okay, great, thank you. And I'm just going to squeeze one more in here from Agnes. So Agnes, she wanted to know about the data about mothers' antenatal intentions about using ECE, and then she found that very interesting, the reality of what actually happened. And she wanted to know whether those mothers' intention to use ECE at 9 months and 24 months, was that at the time, was that 9 months and 24 months, does that refer to when the data was collected, or was that when they were intending to, at those ages that they were intending to put their children into or access ECE for their children?
So they were asked at each of those time points. They were asked antenatally. They were also asked about parental leave. So will you take parental leave, and for how long, and when do you expect to go back to work if you're in work, and those sorts of things. So they were asked antenatally what the intentions were for both parental leave and early childhood and childcare type services. And then at 9 months, and then again at 24 months, they were asked about what actually happened. And so there's quite a lot of information that we can sort of see about when and where and to what extent those diverged. And we also asked about the reasons behind that and what sort of drove the change in decision, or for it to be the same as what you're intending.
Interesting, thank you. I think that we've run out of time now. Thanks very much, Kane.
No problem.
Over to you, Justine.
Kia ora, Deb, and thank you, Kane, for your presentation this evening. There is such a wealth of information that's coming from the Growing Up in New Zealand study, and we thank you for sharing a slice of it with us in this presentation. I know that it was challenging for you to try and constrain such a huge amount of data, but what you've shared with us is really relevant and really important. And it also illustrates the complexity of the lives of children and their families in Aotearoa New Zealand, and the many factors that are contributing to and impacting on children's experiences, particularly in relation to education. So you've given us plenty to reflect on in relation to care and education that we offer to our young tamariki and their whānau in the early years. So ngā mihi nui ki a koe quite, Kane. Thank you very much. I know some people did still have potentially questions, so please do go back to the recording and have a look, and you'll find Kane's contact details there if you want to contact him and ask more questions about this very important study. And again, if you want to share or revisit this presentation, please do check out our Early Childhood Seminar Series YouTube channel. So the recording of this seminar will be available in a couple of days, and we're looking forward to seeing you all back for our next seminar in early April, when we will have Professor Alex Gunn with us, and Alex will be talking about assessment in early childhood education. So keep an eye on your inbox for the flyer and the registration information for that. But thank you again for joining us this evening, and we'll close with a whakatauki. Manaaki whenua, manaaki tangata, haere whakamua. Care for the land, care for the people, go forward. Take good care, everyone. Kia kaha, kia ora, kia atawhai, ka kite anō.